For our greatest minds today, Professor David W. Blight is dropping by talking about his new book about Frederick Douglass. It's fascinating. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, and subscribe to our channel. Professor David W. Blight is with us. He's professor of American history and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He's the author or editor of a dozen books. His latest is Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. His Twitter handle is David W. Blight, B-L-I-G-H-T, and the website is davidwblight.com. Professor Blight, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Good to be with you.
And thank you for this brilliant book. Let's kind of start at the beginning. Who was Frederick Douglass?
Well, he was a slave born in a remote spot on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1818. And he spent 20 years as a slave, about 11 of those years out on the eastern shore of Maryland, and about 9 of those years in Baltimore. He escaped from Baltimore in 1838 to New York, and then on to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Within a short time, within 3 years, in fact, he was discovered as a preacher at a local black AME church, and then invited onto the abolitionist circuit as an orator. He took that circuit by storm with his own personal stories and his embittered critique of American slavery, which, of course, he had experienced. He then goes on to be one of the greatest orators of American history and one of our great writers. He will write 3 autobiographies. He'll write hundreds and hundreds of short-form editorials in his anti-slavery newspaper. And then he wrote thousands of speeches, for which he's particularly most famous. He lives all the way to 1895, becomes the principal African-American spokesman of his people. A great literary figure, but also, he stands there kind of across the 19th century as an interpreter and an embodiment of these greatest issues of the 19th century in America: slavery, its destruction and abolition, the Civil War, Reconstruction. And he lives all the way to the age of the Jim Crow laws and the lynching problem. So the trajectory of this man's life as an orator, a statesman, and a writer is quite remarkable. And
it's also an extraordinary lens through which we can look at that entire era.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
No, well, there's so many issues in Douglass's life. I've been told this by many, many readers in reading about his life and the crises he lived through and his analysis of those crises, that they see so much of today's problems in his life and in his ideas, and it's true.
For example?
We are still living with the idea every day of what does it mean to be an American? Who is an American? What does it mean to have birthright citizenship in this country? And what are the legacies of slavery? The legacies of emancipation of the slaves in the Civil War, and then the legacies of Reconstruction, particularly those great constitutional amendments. And then, of course, what is equality? We are still every day working on that problem of how do you establish equality between people right here on Earth and equality before the law. All of those issues were the heart of Douglass's life and are at the heart of his analysis. He's also, I should say, in terms of his importance, he's a quite amazing man of words and letters. He became, by a whole variety of means, but he became a genius with language, a word master supreme. And he lives on essentially in his words, in the autobiographies, the first of which is now widely taught across the country and the world, but also some of his great speeches, like his 4th of July speech, among others, he's remembered largely in his language and in his words, which is only appropriate because it was essentially the only weapon he ever had.
Following the Civil War, there was extraordinary optimism, might even be an understatement,
Sure.
among the freed slaves, enslaved people of the South, that things are going to work now, right? The Northern Army was occupying the South. In Georgia and in South Carolina in particular, you saw significant numbers of African Americans getting elected to legislatures. The Georgia Constitution was rewritten, as I recall, in what was it, 1864, 65, something like that, in order to get them back into the Union. I mean, and there were between a dozen and 20 African Americans who participated in that process, if I'm remembering correctly. Major stuff. And how did Douglass respond to this explosion of optimism? And then how did he respond to when Andrew Johnson started blowing this stuff up and withdrawing the Union soldiers and letting the South go back to doing what they did? How did he respond to that? And how did America respond to those two things, and to what extent were they in sync or not?
Yeah, well, this is the heart of the story of Reconstruction and the aftermath of the Civil War. It was a time for at least 3 to 5 years of explosions of hope among African Americans and their many allies in the North, particularly among the Republicans, the radical Republicans, and a lot of people who believed they had fought, bled, and died and lost their sons and husbands, not only to save the Union, but to destroy slavery. And Douglass's response was to share that optimism and that hope. After all, it's worth thinking about here. He's an example of a radical outsider, an abolitionist. Abolitionists were radicals, always on the outside, knocking on the door. They never, ever were mainstream. But he lives to experience victory. His cause actually wins and triumphs in the Civil War. Granted, it happened through enormous bloodshed. But in its wake, there was tremendous hope in 1865, 6, 7, 8, even 69, even 70. You have the passage of the 3 great Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, the first Civil Rights Act ever passed in America in 1866. Reconstruction in the South is put in place as a means of remaking Southern society, of remaking these Southern state governments. The 11 ex-Confederate states don't get back into the Union without ratifying the 14th Amendment, which is equality before law, without giving the right to vote to black men, or at least they were supposed to. It didn't take them very long to start resisting that, of course. And I'll answer your question by pointing to a particular speech Douglass gave. He first wrote it in 1867. It's a speech called The Composite Nation. He gives it for about 3 years, 67 to 1870 or so. And that speech, it's a remarkable speech. He took it on the road, gave it many, many times, which is what he always did. But that speech is this vision of an America that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial, all living somehow under a regime of equality before law. It's an argument for how the United States, out of this god-awful bloody war, had been given the opportunity, as no nation ever had, to create such a country that would welcome all religions, all ethnicities, all races, and so forth. It's also a vision of an America that would even spread and expand these ideas, because out of that, Douglass actually does become an American expansionist of a kind. Now, that speech, if you read it today, it reads almost like a framework statement for multiculturalism from the 1990s, or
what was the date of the speech?
Statement. I'm sorry?
What was the date of the speech?
He first gave it in 1867, so it's right at the peak of, the Reconstruction laws, the radical Reconstruction. Right. He keeps giving it for on and off for the next 2-3 years. So far as I could tell, he never gave it again after 1870 or 71, because it just didn't fit the context anymore. But it's this vision of the possibility that the Civil War had brought. It's incredibly optimistic when you read it. I mean, it reads like a diversity manifesto for our own time. And so that is a window into the kind of optimism that the war did bring about. Because when he first crafted that speech in 1867, black men had been given the right to vote. Equality before law is in the 14th Amendment. For Civil Rights Act was passed, at least giving people some option to pursue discrimination cases in court. It actually looked like the country might make good on what emancipation had meant, that is transforming it.
Welcome back. Professor Blight, so Frederick Douglass went from this extraordinary optimism with his 1867 speech through the next 3 or 4 years, and then what happened? How did he respond to the loss of Reconstruction?
Well, that's a slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. He's still very much in agreement with the Republican Party into the 1870s, although he begins to see that they're pulling back on enforcement of the law of the Reconstruction Acts in the South.
He was living in the North at that time, was he not?
He's sorry?
He was living in the North at that time?
Oh, yes. He's still living at that point in Rochester, New York. He lives in Rochester, New York till 1872, when his house was burned, probably by arson.
Wow.
And then he moved his entire extended family to Washington, D.C. So after 1872, he's living in the national capital, which became an interesting part of a hugely interesting part of his life, because he wanted to be at the center. He wanted to get inside of power. He wanted to get inside the circles of the Republican Party if he could. Now, he does become embittered to a degree through the course of the 1870s. You can see this in his writings. You can see this in certain speeches. And he issues all kinds of warnings about how much the federal government, and therefore the Republican Party, is pulling back from what they had indeed created. And though he will be disappointed with the kinds of compromises Republicans are making after the Grant years, he was more than willing to accept a federal appointment from Rutherford B. Hayes, who gets elected in that disputed election in 1876. And he'll get 2 appointments, one out of Hayes, one out of Garfield, inside the federal government. One was as Marshal of the District of Columbia, and one was as a recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia. Now, those may not seem like high offices, but they were important. And they were very symbolically important that an African-American would be appointed to that. And it brought him a salary because he had never made a dime in his life any other way but with his voice and his pen.
Wow.
And, with his newspaper and his oratory from 1841 to 1877. I always say to my students, being an abolitionist was not upwardly mobile.
Right.
Not a good career move.
Yeah.
Then even later, he will be appointed the U.S. Minister to Haiti, which means ambassador to Haiti. That comes much later, 1889, under President Harrison. Mm. He spent 2 years in a very difficult, turbulent mission of trying to enforce America's expansionist policies in the Caribbean. He got himself into quite of a mess with that, and he ended up resigning by 1891. But what Douglass becomes here in that period is the old radical outsider who now becomes, to some degree, a political insider. And I find it one of the most fascinating things about his life, because he's the old radical who is now trying to be inside of power, and that means certain deals and compromises have to be made. And
excuse me.
nevertheless, he still remained the fierce voice he had always been.
Dr. Blight, you were talking about Frederick Douglass's after the failure of Reconstruction, he moved to Washington D.C. He was kind of an insider. He was the ambassador to Haiti, essentially. And then kind of was embittered by that. I want to continue down that road and get your thoughts on the last part of his life. I'm curious, though, he gave a speech about the 4th of July and what it means. When was that in this whole arc, and how does that speech speak to today?
Wow, okay. Great question. He gave it in 1852, so it's back earlier in his life. It's after he had moved out to Rochester, New York. He gave the speech in Rochester in a hall with about 600 people. It's the masterpiece or piece of oratory of his life and the rhetorical masterpiece of American abolitionism. It's a speech in which he effectively says, why have you invited me here on the 4th of July? Why me speaking on your Independence Day? He turns this opportunity into a fierce critique of American hypocrisy. Here he is, this former slave, a former fugitive slave in a country still with a huge growing slave population and in an intense political crisis evolving over the expansion of slavery. And he took his audience through what amounts to a kind of symphony in 3 movements. He opens the speech by saying, honor your founding fathers, honor them indeed. They were geniuses. They created this Declaration of Independence with those great principles. And he sets them up, though, for the whole middle of the speech, where he says, but here you are violating those principles. And he takes them through a litany of all the evils of everything from the slave ships and the slave trade to the domestic slave trade in the U.S. to auction blocks and worse. But then at the end, he sort of lets his audience back up. He says, yes, you are hypocrites, but there's still time. Your country is malleable. Your creeds are fine. It's your practices and your behavior that are not fine, but you still have some chance. It's a classic Jeremiad in the old Puritan sense. It's a very biblical speech, which was so typical of Douglass. He rips the heart out of his audience by saying, you are hopeless hypocrites, just like Jeremiah did, or Isaiah, or Ezekiel and the old Hebrew prophets. But then he still turns it into a kind of a vision of hope, if they can learn, if they can change, if the country can find some way of destroying slavery. It's a speech that shows his genius with language and with this form of oratory
and the reason
Jeremiah. And it's used today all over the country on the 4th of July. There are many towns that do public readings of it now because it is a way of reminding ourselves that our project here, this experiment called the American Republic, is always unfinished. We've always got work to do to make it work.
Professor Blight, we have just 50 seconds left.
Sure.
What would Douglass's message for today be, do you believe?
Oh, his message would be to protest, resist, learn, read, write, fight, agitate, as he so often said, agitate.
The message of his life at the time.
Exactly. And join social movements. Gather together and uphold the natural rights tradition and the American creeds of the first principles of the Declaration.